All right, everybody, welcome back to Discovering Multifamily. I'm your host, Anthony Scandariato with Red Knight Properties. Hope everybody was doing well. And we have a very special guest with us here today, a good friend of mine, Chris Fiduccia. And he is a commercial real estate, actually commercial insurance specialist, but has a heavy focus on real estate at James A. O'Connor's, and is based in New Jersey and has a lot of experience in understanding what your coverages actually mean from many different standpoints. And the more I've been in this business, the more people that I'm associated with just look at the underlying costs of the policy, but don't really understand, what's driving those costs. And, if you're paying a little bit higher premium, am I actually getting better coverage? So we kind of want to go back to the basics here a little bit, because I feel like this is a topic at least for most real estate investors, overlook. And I've been, guilty of that myself. So want to thank Chris for coming on the show, and we'll look forward to having this discussion.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for having me, Anthony. I really appreciate it.
Awesome.
So I mean, don't feel bad that you were one to kind of not really take the look into the policies the way some people should. It's very common, especially when people first start off. They don't really think about coverages or how to understand it. Basically, most of the time they're either in a rush to get insurance in place so that they can close, and I've had to deal a lot with that, and it's not an ideal position to be in, especially when purchasing. So it's best to kind of look into this stuff early on and get a good understanding of what kind of coverages you need, especially for the property that you're purchasing. To start off with, and as you said, some people do focus just specifically on the price, but we really want to dive into the policy itself. First and foremost, the coverage for property, right? So what you want to do is you want to protect the actual structure itself. You want to make sure that you're going to have sufficient coverage if you sustain a fire, some kind of storm comes through, destroys the building, any number of things. And I can provide a whole list of that if anybody's ever interested in that. And typically what happens is people might underestimate the replacement cost. A lot of times I see people saying, well, the building's not worth that much. That's not how much I bought it for. And that's understandable. That's typically a market value that you're comparing to. But what we want to look at is the replacement cost. We want to get a good understanding of how much it would be to replace the building if it came down all the way down to the ground. More often than not, people are hesitant to want to come up with that estimate because in their mind it's, well, if I have a fire, the whole building might not come down. But even if you sustain figure 75 to 80% damages, at that point, you might just knock the whole thing down. Then you need to factor in the cost of debris removal. Remove everything and then build it back to the way it was. And the way insurance companies estimate it is not so much how much it's going to cost you to rebuild it, because a lot of people who invest in properties, they might be builders and they may be able to build this stuff and fix it themselves for a lot less. The insurance company is looking to see how much it would cost for them to hire another contractor to come in, material, labor costs, and as I said before, debris removal. And that's how you get the full replacement cost of the building. And typically that's estimated based off of the square footage of the building. Are there any questions so far? Or?
Yeah. So kind of going back to that, what are the specific drivers of the premium? Now you talk about replacement cost being the number one driver. What are some of the other factors in the premium?
Great question. Another factor could be the liability. There's always liability coverage as well in your policy. And you want to make sure you have sufficient liability coverage as well. So the liability could be, depending on the type of risk that it is. If it's just a simple residential location, the risk might just be the tenants who are walking in the parking lot might slip and fall. Wintertime, of course, you have to factor in ice. Um, those tend to be kind of high. And then if it's a commercial use property, then you have a lot of customers coming in. So you have a lot more foot traffic coming through. So that factor might be a little higher. There might be a higher risk there. And liability figure, the typical liability limit you might see in a policy is 1 million, 1 million per occurrence, and 2 million aggregate. 2 million aggregate being the most that the policy will pay out in one policy year. What I like to tell my clients is the best way to gauge whether or not you have enough liability limit is to kind of factor in what the total cost would be if you had to, let's say, sell the building, right? What the market value is. And what you're essentially doing with a liability policy is you're protecting the assets of the business. So you're protecting the full assets of that property. So if you think your building might be able to sell for 2.5 million, I always say estimate to the nearest million up. So 2.5 million, have at least 3 million per occurrence. This way you don't have to worry about anybody coming after your assets or suing you to take over any part of the building or whatever it might be,
Right. And what are some of the areas you see real estate owners not understand or sort of undercover on? You talk about liability, and I know there's many layers to liability, including umbrella on top of their general liability. Can you kind of talk about that in greater detail and why that's important?
Yeah. So more often than not, we typically see people underestimating the building value, and again, it goes back to what I said before. They feel that the building's not worth that much, so it shouldn't be covered for that much, and that could pose a problem, especially because some of the insurance companies, they don't want to insure the building unless it's insured to value. Or they'll put a stipulation on the policy. So there's a difference between replacement cost and actual cash value. So replacement cost would be what it would cost to replace the building at the time of the loss or the part of the building that was damaged. Actual cash value is more along the lines of a depreciated amount. So a lot of you may be familiar with a deductible. Let's say you have $1,000 deductible and you sustain about $100,000 of damage on your building. Then the insurance company is expected to pay everything the 100,000 minus the 1,000 deductible. In a situation of actual cash value, that may not be the case. There might be another estimated amount that they'll come up with, and then you'll be surprised to find out that you have to fork up $5,000 to $10,000 out of your own pocket, and then the insurance company covers the rest. So a lot of people will try to pinch pennies and get the premium down by not having the right amount of coverage. And in the end, if something does happen, then it's not worth it because you may have saved maybe a couple $100 a year, but then when you find yourself paying $10,000 out of pocket, it's going to hurt.
Yeah. And what advice would you have for real estate owners? Let's say they're buying top of the line, class A, high rise, multifamily in Hoboken or wherever it is, in a very dense location that's newer construction. Do you suggest for them to, take a lower deductible because the risk is actually take a higher deductible because the risk is much lower for, things to happen? Or does age not really matter? Because like you said, a fire could happen. There could be loss of income through certain circumstances. does age matter when you're writing a policy and how you look at the premiums and deductibles?
Age could matter in factoring in the premiums because if it's a much older building, it might be a lot harder to replace that type of material. As time goes on, I think everybody could agree that a lot of material has gotten cheaper and cheaper with the way they build. I think the biggest thing was in the before the 1940s or 1930s, they were using 4x4s, whereas now everything is 2x4s, right? So that's a difference to factor in. Age of building. I'm sorry. Can you repeat the question again?
Yeah, no. So the age of the building does, from a real estate owner's perspective, if I was looking at a high-rise Class A product, and I wanted my deductible to be 15, 20,000, 50,000, the highest it could be, do you think that's less risk for the owner? Whereas on my older building, I want, maybe my deductible to be a little lower because I know that my cost out of pocket when things do happen are going to be substantially higher.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's a great point. The deductible. That's a method of looking into whether or not you want to be able to save a little bit on premiums as well. Because if you have, let's say, a 10 or $15 million building that you need to insure, at that point you might want to look into having a little bit of a higher deductible. Instead of 1,000, maybe bump it up to 5,000. And that's a good alternative to saving money as opposed to reducing the coverage. One of the things that I try to tell my clients, don't reduce the coverage. If you think it makes sense to increase the deductible, you might get some cost savings there. But I would also highly advise that you have some sort of reserve account in case something goes wrong where it could cover that deductible. I see this a lot in condo associations, actually. You mentioned high rises, so condo associations, it could happen. You might have a $50 million building, and then maybe we want to take a look at having a 10, 20, or maybe even a $50,000 deductible. It helps bring the costs down. And then built into the bylaws of the condo association, you might have something in there stating that if there is a loss, all the unit owners will be assessed that loss. And that's okay, because you know what? In the unit owners' policies, they'll have a specific coverage in there for loss assessment. So if the association assesses a loss on these unit owners because of the damage, as long as it's a covered cause of loss, then everybody's policy will pay out, and it could help offset the cost of that deductible.
That makes a lot of sense. And getting back to the main driver of the premium, the replacement cost a little bit, who comes up with that value? So is it an independent appraiser that works for the insurance company? How do they come up with it? And is that the only method for replacement costs, or is, because there's insurable value too, is the replacement cost always equal to insurable value? How do those two correlate?
That's a great question. It's always been a little difficult to answer that. Every company has a different insurable value, and a lot of companies may use a third-party assessor to go out there and do an inspection, and then they come back with their report on what they believe the replacement cost is. On average, I would say everybody comes within a similar frame of cost. So, for example, I would say whenever I'm trying to run a quote, I get the square footage of the building. I get an idea of what the build is like and the structure is like. And let's say a frame building that's, I don't know, a 10-unit apartment building. I go by $175 per square foot. That's on average what a lot of places use. A lot of assessors will use that. And that's a good gauge for what the replacement cost value will be.
Got it. And that's a value regardless of the age, that 175, or
No, age will have a factor in it as well. But that's why, I stick with 175, because then they might come around and say more like 160 per square foot, or they might turn around and say that if it's been updated recently and it's a higher grade build, you have nicer bathrooms, nicer kitchens, maybe some granite countertops, then you're looking more into the 200 to 210 a square foot.
got it. And so when you're working with your clients that have these appraisals done independently, and they're not happy with it, or there's a disconnect that they see, have you seen a case where there's two appraisals being done, or maybe even three appraisals? Because like you said, it might not even be worth it, because usually they're within a 10% difference on average anyway. Is that how you operate, if that is the case?
I've seen some companies come back and say, if you don't agree with the values, then put it in writing and maybe hire somebody else to do this, to come up with a better value. But at that point, like you said, the difference could be negligible, and it's not really something that somebody's willing to invest. If it's a significant difference, then it might be worth investing and going down that road. However, I've not experienced that yet. Most of my clients would turn around and just say, okay, you know what, it doesn't sound like it's going to be much, and they just go with what the insurance company comes up with.
Got it. And another follow-up question would be, when you're underwriting a new policy on a property that needs a lot of work, and the work may have to do with the roof, it may have to do with electric, it may have to do with plumbing, are there certain things that an insurance company will look for that they will absolutely not write a policy on, or is it on a case-by-case basis?
Uh,
Anything
there's
uniform? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's certain things that they look for. They want to make sure that there's at least some sort of sound build, right? So, um, the place is not falling apart. It wouldn't be deemed completely inhabitable. They want to make sure that the risk is low, even on the outside, right? Figure if there's a lot of trip hazards outside, they might turn around and be inclined to come off of the policy. And in situations like that, there's special policies we need to put into place until all that stuff is fixed, recovered. Um, Currently, during this pandemic, a lot of companies are um, they're giving more time and they're waiving a lot of these inspections. But it's all in good faith. They're hoping that everybody is kind of staying on top of it and fixing it as best as they could. There's a great understanding that not everybody is able to function to the fullest of their ability right now. Um, but if there's significant damage to, let's say, a unit, they might turn around and say, you need a different policy for this. Or another issue you might run into is if about 50% of the building is vacant because it needs to be fixed or repaired, then they're going to come off and say, you need to get yourself a partially vacant policy and then purchase a builder's risk policy. Builder's risk is a policy that will cover you for the time that you're building out or you're making the repairs. It covers for in case of a fire and you lose all your material that may be stored in the unit, or any theft, because now that the place is vacant, who's there to watch it? Who's there to keep people out of it? You get people that are kind of breaking into places that they know construction is going on, and they end up stealing a lot of the equipment for themselves or the material. So that's a special policy to get in place as well.
Makes sense. And last question that I do have, and you mentioned the pandemic. What sort of items on existing policies should real estate owners be looking at right now, as it relates to any loss of income from the pandemic? Personally, I haven't seen it yet, but I know some owners have seen it. So any advice for them?
Okay, great question. So a lot of times what you'll see on a policy is endorsements and exclusions. So insurance is never really black and white. There's a lot of fine print, um, and a lot of this stuff is put together by attorneys. So you could just imagine what the writing is like, and trying to read and interpret all that. Um, However, a lot of it is left for interpretation. So one of the biggest problems that a lot of business owners are finding when they go to put in claims during this pandemic is that they don't have the proper covered cause of loss in their policy. And the policy may specifically say any virus, bacteria, or communicable disease is excluded. What I'm finding is a lot of our clients at our agency are putting in claims saying that the loss is not due to the virus, the loss is due to executive order. The state mandated that they shut down, so they have to close the doors, lose income, and now they're trying to put in these claims. Some of the responses we've seen is that the companies are coming back saying, yeah, but it's indirectly related to the virus. So if you haven't had an issue with the virus, and you don't have the exclusion, then they could turn around and say it's not a direct cause of loss because of the virus. So companies right now are finding ways to not pay these claims, but they're fighting. But my suggestion is to look into the fine details of the policy in those endorsements and exclusions to see if you have a virus exclusion, pandemic exclusion, something that specifically says it. Otherwise, what I would do is make sure that the policy you get is broad enough to not have those exclusions there. And it kind of opens up the window so that it could be interpreted by a judge stating whether or not you could actually collect on the loss of income. In situations of like this pandemic with real estate, you have a loss of income from rent. A lot of these businesses have to shut their doors. Now you're going to lose a lot of clients. You're going to lose a lot of tenants. And even in the habitational unit, you're going to have a lot of tenants that may not be able to afford to pay their rent. So what are you going to do then? That's probably a good talking point to take a look at your policy and see if those exclusions are there.
Wow, yeah, it makes a lot of sense, and definitely very up to date. So definitely listen to that last piece of advice from Chris. Well, Chris, thanks so much again for coming on the show. How can people find you if they want to reach out to you?
They could reach me on my LinkedIn. My LinkedIn is, you have all my contact information there. They could also reach me by email if they want, and that's cfiducia@jamesaconnors.com. So cfiducia, CFIDUCCIA @jamesaconnors.com.
Great, and I'll be posting in the comments section. I'll be posting a link to the email and Chris's LinkedIn. Anywhere else they can find you?
They should be able to find me on the website as well of James A. Connors at jamesaconnors.com.
Awesome. Well, we'll be posting both all three of those things. Thanks again, Chris, for coming on. Definitely up-to-date information, and I always like going back to basics, and hopefully that was kind of a refresher for my listeners as well. So definitely appreciate you coming on again. Hope to have you again soon.
Thank you. I appreciate it, and I hope to come on again soon too.
Awesome.